James might seem to be a rather nondescript title for a novel. And without meaning any offence to the Jameses of this world, and there are many of you out there, why should we care about this particular one? Well, if I tell you that you've most likely already heard of this James, probably as Jim, you might start to have an inkling of who I'm talking about. And if I tell you that he has a young companion by the name of Huckleberry, well, at this point, I've probably given the game away. Percival Everett's James is a retelling of Mark Twain's classic and canonical American novel, Huckleberry Finn. Like most retellings, it asks us to reconsider a familiar story from an unfamiliar perspective. And in this case, it takes Huck's light-footed scamper down the Mississippi and turns it into something altogether darker. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode I invite an expert to give their views on a text or author, and today I'm in fact joined by a whole panel of experts on American literature. Sheri-Marie Harrison, Andrew Hoberek, both from the University of Missouri, Arin Keeble from Edinburgh Napier University, and Matt Seybold from Elmira College. I hope our conversation inspires you to read James, and if you have anything to say about the novel or our conversation, please leave us a comment. And if you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm joined today by Sheri-Marie Harrison, Andrew Hoberek, Arin Keeble, and Matt Seybold. Sheri-Marie Harrison is Associate Professor and Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Faculty Success in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Missouri. She's the author of Difficult Subjects, Negotiating Sovereignty in Post-Colonial Jamaican Literature, which was published in 2014, and she currently has 2 book projects in progress, one on Marlon James and one on contemporary black fiction. Andrew Hoberek is Professor of English, also at the University of Missouri. He's author of The Twilight of the Middle Class, Post-World War II American Fiction and White-Collar Work, published in 2005, and Considering Watchmen, Poetics, Property, Politics, published in 2015. He's also editor of the Cambridge Companion to John F. Kennedy, also published in 2015. Arin Keeble is lecturer in the School of Arts and Creative Industries at Edinburgh Napier University. He's author of the 9/11 novel, Trauma, Politics and Identity, published in 2014, Narratives of Hurricane Katrina in Context, Literature, Film and Television, published in 2019, and more recently, 21st Century Fictions of Terrorism, published earlier this year, that's 2024. Last but not least, Matt Seybold is Associate Professor of American Literature and Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College. As his title suggests, he's one of the world-leading experts on Mark Twain. He's also written extensively on literature and economics. He's co-editor of Routledge Companion to Literature and Economics, and he's also host of the American Vandal podcast, which I'll link to in the episode description. It's fantastic to have such an august panel of experts on American literature with me today, and I welcome them all to the World Literature Podcast. Thank you all so much for joining me. Great to have you here and to be talking about Percival Everett's James. So we have much to talk about. But Arin, I'll start with you because you're someone I know who's been championing him for quite a long time. Could you begin just by telling us a little bit about the novel, why you think people might be interested in reading it, maybe also a little bit more about Everett as well as a writer and his whole career? You're on mute at the moment.
Sure, Ivan. Thanks very much. And thank you for having me on this. It's a pleasure to be here and really nice to be chatting with such a great cast of scholars whose work I admire so much. So James is a retelling or adaptation of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. It's narrated in the first person by the enslaved man Jim, who in Everett's novel names himself as James. So like some other instances of literary revision, there are some kind of acts of reversal. So notably, as James and Huck kind of come together as their flight converges, because James is an escaped slave and Huck is partially fleeing his abusive father, Pap. As their flight converges and they escape down the Mississippi, life on the raft is a state of kind of constant peril and terror for James. Whereas in Huckleberry Finn, remember that kind of famous line where Huck says life was mighty free and easy on a raft. And of course, it wasn't necessarily Twain's vision for life to be free and easy on a raft on the Mississippi, but that was his view, was adventure. It was the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So it's very different kind of perspective from James's first person narration. And the threat of lynching and other forms of terror kind of loom large throughout the novel. But as much as it is a kind of very much an adaptation or an active revision, I also feel that it's very much a kind of Percival Everett novel. So there's a lot in this novel that kind of picks up and traces themes and ideas that have preoccupied Everett for a long time. Violence, masculinity, isolation, and certainly the power of language and the written word. And also the ways that culture perpetuates white supremacism. And one of the notable things about this book that hasn't actually been discussed very much is the prologue, which is the notebooks of Daniel Decatur Emmett, who wrote the song Dixie, which is something that Everett's written about before in his short story from 1988, The Appropriation of Cultures. So, yeah, I guess I would say it's a really interesting adaptation, really interesting active revision, but very much kind of a Percival Everett novel as well, which in itself is a tricky thing to say because famously Everett's known for being very kind of eclectic. His body of work is hugely diverse, and he's worked across numerous different genres and modes. 20-some novels, 5 collections of short stories, 5 collections of poetry, a children's book, visual art. This is kind of a hugely diverse and divergent body of work. So yeah, I guess the other thing I would say about James is that it has some really wonderful and evocative kind of eccentricities that are typical of Everett's writing. The dream sequences where the titular protagonist is kind of in conversation with Locke and Voltaire, and it's interest in Everett's own interest, like fishing, for example. So there are lots of little things that kind of tie it together to this kind of unwieldy body of work.
Thank you. Great introduction. Anybody else want to jump in and just make a kind of pitch for James or for Everett at this point?
I mean, I'm happy to make a pitch for both. And I think one of the things, as Arin was speaking, that I've really been thinking on rereading the book is that of American authors, and especially contemporary authors, really the only comparison for Everett is Pynchon. And I think it's a kind of crucial comparison because while they're both satirists, they're not empty satirists. They're not postmodern in the sense that they do blank pastiche. They are quite committed to absurdist aspects of life, and they are quite committed to being funny as hell. But they're also not just engaged, I think, in satire for the purpose of mockery. There's also a real kind of like driving force there, and I think that's a kind of important thing to keep in mind as you read, especially this novel, because it is so directly a satire.
Thank you. Yeah. And one of the aspects of the novel. I think the first one that struck me and will strike many readers on reading it is that, as Arin pointed out, it's narrated in the first person by James in what's really very sophisticated and eloquent English. But then when he speaks to white characters, he deliberately kind of downgrades his language when within earshot of any white character, as do the other slaves. So, Matt, I'll direct this one to you because I know you've touched on this in a review you wrote of James. Can you say a bit more about this aspect of language? It's based, I understand, to some extent on actual historical fact. What has Everett kind of done with that in this novel?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true that one way of reading the whole novel is as a literacy narrative, which is not unusual for novels and indeed memoirs of enslavement to have the progress towards literacy, progress towards linguistic education be a key central part of the narrative. But for this book in particular, what I found, really pretty ingenious about it was that it acknowledges in some ways the difficulty of imitating Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is oftentimes has been canonized, at least in part, because of its use of dialect and the extent to which Twain really was a student of dialect, including Black dialect, that he began his career certainly sometimes trading in the vulgar minstrel tradition. But certainly by the time he wrote Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and really for many years before that, he was a avid listener to a wide variety of voices and was really studiously trying to capture the dialects of the people around him. And that's something that Percival Everett can't really do, right? That for whatever insight he might have into the history and culture of enslaved people, he has not spent as much time listening to them as Mark Twain had, right? And one of the way he gets around that problem is by creating these, two linguistic communities, right? Or these two linguistic traditions. One, which is the one that Mark Twain hears because he's white, and all the white people of Hannibal are only hearing enslaved people, Black characters, talk in that lingo. But then the other is one, where we see James habituating, all of the sort of Western cultural tradition, right? And I think that this does, on the one hand, it solves a problem for Everett of the relationship between his book and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but it also creates this continuity between, Black studies of the present and James, right? So that we actually have things like code switching and hush harbors and signifying and infrapolitics, right? All of these sort of aspects of theories around how race is coded and how the language of race operates that have sort of been articulated by a number of Black theorists primarily in the 20th and 21st century. Everett can sort of bring that tradition into the book. He does so very consciously, sometimes even using the language of those theorists, and that sort of then opens up the book for all of these ways of thinking, right? And it creates, and this is something that David Bradley says about Huckleberry Finn, even, right? That it creates a continuity between the thinking of the enslaved and their ancestors, right? That this continuity between African Americans in the 20th century or 21st century and the people from whom they came, that was something that David Bradley found even in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But I think that we can see that continuity amplified in the way Percival Everett draws these connections between thinkers like, Fred Moten or Henry Louis Gates and this character he invents in James.
I'd bring Frantz Fanon in here too, especially the sociogenic principle where humanness occurs in terms of proximity to the acquisition of language and literacy. Like there's a shout out to Martinicans in the novel. Like if there's, Everett is, if anything, is often very subtle, but this one was just like, it was almost like a brick over the head for me where, he says the same way a Black man in Martinique can learn French and so become French is almost lifted entirely from Black Skin, White Mask. And so it's also very interesting how it is this novel is situated in a larger I guess Fanon's moment is like a Pan-African moment, right? A larger Black studies moment too that goes beyond the US in some really interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing to say. Go ahead.
I was just going to hat tip a lecture that Sheri-Marie Harrison gave here at the Center for Mark Twain Studies a couple of years ago, in which before James was written, even before maybe James was conceived, she was drawing attention to the way that Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was becoming this archive or common allusion amongst a whole range of global Black authors, right? And so in some ways James is sort of fitting into an existing tradition of Black satire that uses Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, oftentimes just particular scenes, right, instead of the whole novel. But there's already this tradition that she points to of trading on this novel as a source text for a whole global community of Black satirists.
Thanks, Matt. I think it's also really interesting against the backdrop too of the pre-show conversation about James and his position in American letters and the way in which when we think about American letters in this moment, there's a different, if we're putting a Black writer in the center of the conversation in that way, there is a way in which we also have to think about how they're participating, not just in a national conversation in ways that other authors might have, but one that might be larger, that's stretching back to 1960s theorists, that isn't just a US or an American-based conversation. It's also, I missed the conversation at ASAP that was but that was partially the genesis of this conversation, right? And I think Howard Ramsby was also supposed to be talking about how this novel functions as a neo-slave narrative, and how in the narratives of the ennaved, James takes umbrage with the related by. He's just like, you're not going to relate anything to me. I'm going to write it down myself. There is also this sense of writing as what produces self. But also like a rejection of that in some ways too, because it's almost as though every time you apprehend something about this novel that is addressing the way in which we think about the imbrication between letters and the ability to produce letters and think, and the way that produces what is human, then, Everett gives you something else that's just like, no, shut up, Voltaire, I hate you. You know what I mean? And so it's playing with a whole larger Enlightenment humanist way of thinking about not just race, but humanness too, in some really interesting ways.
And I wanted to make just a kind of a quick point about the transnational stuff that Sheri brought up, which is that there's a moment where he, you're expecting this at some point and it comes. There's a moment where he invokes an actual slave revolt from the period, reminding us that these did happen. Nat Turner is always the go-to, but he goes with Denmark Vesey. And I think that's important because Vesey, the revolt itself is in South Carolina, but Vesey biographically has connections to Bermuda and especially Haiti. And so, I think that's an important choice at that moment. That is one of the indicators that he's subtly thinking in these kinds of transnational ways that Sheri brought up.
I'll just add to that I'm working on an essay about this right now, and I don't know that Everett would necessarily have known this, but the Vesey revolt would have been one that Twain would have been more likely to know the details of himself, in part because one of his close friends and actually his booking agent, James Redpath, was an organizer and was somebody who was very closely invested in and spent a lot of time in Charleston, and so knew the details of the Vesey revolt much better than probably just about any white person would have in the 1860s and 1870s when he was spending a lot of time with Twain.
I wanted to come back to the idea of the novel as satire, because a lot of what we talked about so far, you've gone into sort of aspects of, Black theory, post-colonial theory. At the same time, though, I think particularly early on in the novel, it feels quite light, some of the humor, or there are moments of lightness, let's say, particularly when James makes slips with his language that are really quite funny, and has to kind of recover and pretend again that he's, only capable of this sort of basic speech. Another aspect that I found surprising, at least with what knowledge I have, was that it's about his attitude towards religion, and actually declares himself to be an atheist at one point. So, Sheri-Marie, question for you in this case, is this pure sort of fictionalization from Everett? Is there sort of historical basis for this kind of thing? Is it a fictional gambit that Everett's making? And just in general, what did you make of that aspect of Jim's character?
That's really interesting because religion is a slippery fish. I mean, in some ways, especially in this context, right? And depending on what kind of text we're talking about, religion, the conversion narrative is incredibly pivotal to narratives of the enslaved, right? So there's always a conversion narrative that marks the point when you achieve personhood to the extent that you can become fully free, because you've got freedom in religion and freedom in the sense of whatever the prevailing economic system. But James says there's no God. But what's interesting is that he doesn't say there is no God, period. He says there's no God inside of the white man's religion. And one of the things that participating in religious practices as they are in white Protestant religious practices as they appear historically in this space, the logic that James gives for that is the more better they feels, the more safer we be. And I mean, that's like one of the really funny moments, right? Like he's teaching the children, like the children say, we're safer if we just, we worship and we pray and we do all the good things. And then he says, no, that's not how you say it. You have to say it in this other way. And so one of the things that religion is doing here, or that Everett does with religion here, is he draws attention to the contrivance of the slave narrative form, right? That this particular relating of conversion relating of occupying a Christian faith. If you think about narratives like Mary Prince and how central her connection to the Moravians were in appealing not only to her owners, but also to various groups in London in the 19th century for assistance in all kinds of ways. Religion is a tool. And one of the things that it's not so much the atheism as it is the recognition of how this particular thing functions inside of this ideological milieu, and showing this enslaved person as having the capacity to read the room and know, here is how we need to use this, and passing that knowledge down to children is also something that's really interesting. Like it's set in the 19th century, but it's got such a contemporary consciousness, right? It's like it's the equivalent of giving your children the talk if you're Black, right, about the cops. There are ways that it reflects inside of that register that there is a shape that life is inscribed with, and there are things that you have to navigate, and religion is one of the things that you have to navigate and do things with to remain safe.
Can I just add very quickly to that? And I want to make clear, I think James is a wonderful novel to read, independent of whether or how recently you have read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But I also think they are two highly complementary texts, which both benefit from being read alongside one another in either order. And building off of what Sheri said, like, in part, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is about a crisis of faith from an adolescent white boy who can't reconcile white supremacy and institutionalized Protestant Christianity in his community. And so one of the fascinating things about reading these texts alongside one another is you have these two visions of religion and the impact that it's having on contemporaries, and yet they can't really talk about it. They can't really come together about it. So we're seeing these two characters sort of who are very closely related with one another in both novels, depending on how you mean related, right? But who are both sort of having these crises of faith, who are both trying to reconcile themselves with religion, and yet they can't really talk about it on the same terms. And I think that's one fascinating thing about reading the books together is that, like, Everett manages to show how much James could have helped Huck with what he was going through, but because of the racial difference between them, they're never able to bridge that gap.
Another thing I think that's interesting about the atheism too, just to sort of put it on the table, and it's related to the satire question as well, is how much this book, especially once it kind of leaves the plot of Huckleberry Finn, actually becomes what in a way it always was, which is also a pastiche of Candide. It's like how engaged this book is with Candide sort of took me aback this time around when I wasn't thinking so strictly through the lens of Twain. And, again, another book about a young white ingenue, but the ending especially, I think, is just, it's directly engaged. The Candide ends with the famous kind of cultivate your garden, the world is terrible, so take to your pastoral retreats. And of course, like the ending, is like, no spoilers, but it involves the literal destruction of a farm.
Yeah, we'll try to keep spoilers to a minimum. Sorry, Arin. Obviously, it starts off as a retelling of Huck from another perspective, but it does go elsewhere at the end. So maybe we try to avoid the big zingers towards the end. Sorry, carry on.
No, I just have one tiny thing to add to those great points about the novel's kind of engagement with white Christianity. I guess it's worth pointing out that position is entirely consistent with Everett's body of work, and that so many of his protagonists have articulated a similar position in the contemporary moment. You only need to think of Monk in Erasure, who's whose sister is killed by white Christian terrorists. And that's one of many instances where his fiction engages critically with white Christianity.
I want to take us back, like just briefly too, because I think that was really interesting that happened when, just for the conversation, I reviewed the novel again in audiobook, and I didn't turn it off immediately. And what loads, like there is in the audiobook version, there is a preview of Huck Finn. And so before I turned it off, I could listen to the beginning of Huck Finn again. And I didn't remember that Huck invokes Tom Sawyer. Like Huck Finn begins with saying, you know, you don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And he also says, like, you know, Mark Twain told the truth mainly, but like there's the same conceit of retelling, right? Of you're going to get to know me through this book that's written. And I just wanted to raise that from Matt's point too about both novels are super rich on their own, but like there's so much joy to be had looking at them side by side. I mean, joy is a loose word here. I mean, like a really nerdy word given the content, but yeah, it's very interesting to sort of think about them on the page together, side by side.
Yeah, and we'll go into actually what the retelling does to the original, to Huck, in the second part. So I think this is a good time to take a break. So thank you very much for your comments so far. For those listening and watching, please do join us for part 2, where we'll have some more great insights on James by Percival Everett. Hope to see you there.